And the reason that I invited Terese was because, when we first opened about 5 years ago, a woman was in here poking around and she said, "I see you've got a copy of my book. Would you like me to sign it?" And I said, yeah. So she did, and then she was kind enough to come back. She did an awful lot of the research for this book at the Smith College, is it the Archives or the Sophia Smith Collection?
Sophia Smith.
And so she was kind enough to come back and read from her poetry shortly after, and sign some more books. And so when we were doing this year's book festival, and I knew that Lola Ridge had come out because I had been following the track of publication, knowing that she'd been doing all her research up in this area, or much of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, this is a great opportunity to introduce Lola Ridge to the community. So I'm going to turn it over to
Very
you.
good. Thanks.
You don't have to clap for me. You have to jump up if we have anybody walking.
So I will begin at the beginning so you understand who she is, and then you can ask me questions. This is a quote from Catherine Ann Porter, who was a journalist, as you know, and a short story writer, and she was covering the Sacco and Vanzetti trial, and Lola was there demonstrating. One tall, thin figure of a woman stepped out alone, a good distance into the empty square, and when the police came down at her and the horse's hooves beat over her head, she did not move, but stood with her shoulders slightly bowed, entirely still. The charge was repeated again and again, but she was not to be driven away. A man near me said in horror, suddenly recognizing her, "That's Lola Ridge." In 1927, this is the year of the Sacco and Vanzetti trial, Lola Ridge was known to a huge public primarily as the author of The Ghetto and Other Poems, a book that portrayed the immigrant as human, struggling, yes, but with hopes for the future. Sacco and Vanzetti were two such immigrants about to be executed for crimes they most likely did not commit. Ridge, too, was an immigrant, having traveled across the Pacific from New Zealand. Her presence at the demonstration was announced in advance on the front page of major newspapers. She was also an anarchist when anarchy was a political possibility, especially among intellectuals and artists, and immigrants, those who had left their home country to pursue the dream of freedom in the country that promised it. Ridge was the first to delineate the life of the poor in Manhattan, and in particular women's lives in New York City. The title poem of her second book, Sun Up and Other Poems, is a strikingly modernist depiction of a girl's interior life, bad girl's interior life. Harriet Monroe, founder of poetry, and William Rose Benet, founder of the Saturday Review of Literature, called Ridge a genius. 4 years before Eliot's bleak and anti-Semitic The Wasteland, her equally long poem, The Ghetto, celebrated the otherness of the Jewish Lower East Side and prophesied the multi-ethnic world of the 21st century. Quote, a great early chronicler of New York life, wrote three-time poet laureate Robert Pinsky in a Slate column about Ridge in 2011. She embraced her subject along Whitmanian lines, yet here's a small bomb of a poem likened to the poetry of H.D. and Emily Dickinson that remains a model of imagist engagement with the world. Debris. And she wrote this at a time when there was a recession around 1911. I love those spirits that men stand off and point at, or shudder and hood up their souls. Those ruined ones, where liberty has lodged an hour and passed like flame, bursting asunder the too small house. At the end of the teens and the early 1920s, when Ridge was one of the editors of Others and then Broom magazine, she presided over a Thursday afternoon salons filled with modernist hotshots, eating slices of Ridge's cake and drinking whatever prohibition would allow and not. William Carlos Williams and Robert McCalman hatched plans for their magazine Contact. 20-year-old Hart Crane flirted with everyone in sight. Marianne Moore read early drafts of her own work, and Mayakovsky stomped on her coffee table. In 1910, Ridge gave a speech in Chicago entitled Woman and the Creative Will, about how sexually constructed gender roles hinder female development. This was 10 years before Virginia Woolf wrote A Room of One's Own. Woman is not and never has been man's natural inferior, Ridge announced. Although she wrote little personal poetry, Ridge advocated individual liberty. She supported not only the rights of women, but laborers, blacks, Jews, immigrants, and homosexuals. She wrote about lynchings, executions, race riots, and imprisonment. As a rebellious lefty, she interacted closely with the most radical women of her era, from editing Margaret Sanger's magazine on birth control in 1918 to reciting her own poems at her friend Emma Goldman's deportation dinner. Eventually, she was arrested during that demonstration against the execution of Sacco and Vanzetti and hauled off with Edna St. Vincent Millay. In 1936, watching a May Day parade in Mexico City, she raised her fist in solidarity with the marching communists. Despite the praise she received in her obituary in 1941, which described her as one of the leading poets in America, few have heard of her today. She died at the nadir of leftist politics, just as the U.S. was entering World War II. By then, Eliot and Pound had very effectively equated elitism with good in poetry. Surely the 60s generation that rediscovered feminism and anarchy would have resurrected her. Not quite. Although her work appears in two important anthologies of the period, and her life as an anarchist should have had great appeal to the revolutionary spirit of the time, her poetry was not revived. For the last 40 years, her executor has promised a biography and a collected works, contributing much to her relative obscurity and neglect. Feminist critic Louise Bernakow singled out Ridge and Genevieve Taggart as twice neglected because they were women and radicals, part of the buried history within the buried history. Although poetry has always addressed society's problems and recorded its cultural and political history, whatever its formal precepts, society has not always wanted to hear about these subjects. What has been lost by these omissions is the radical and poetic tradition in 20th century American poetry and the idea that such subjects are even appropriate for poetry. An entire generation and tradition has essentially been amputated from literary consciousness. Today, the same neo-fascist threat that Ridge experienced in the earliest years of the century appeals to Americans and Europeans now in search of order and conformity. The truncated branch of poetry that Ridge represents should remind readers that the discourse of today does not have to take the form that it does, and that many self-evident truths are actually hysterical responses to change or threats to privilege. Poets should have a continuing presence in dissent from these truths. I write about something that I feel intensely, Ridge told an interviewer. How can you help writing about something you feel intensely? The freedom she exercised came at a time when the Russians were in revolution and a urinal was put on a pedestal by the Baroness Elsa von Freytag-Lorenhaven, not Duchamp. Politics plus art plus free expression plus women equal fire, Ridge's favorite image. In 2014, Modernist Women Poets, an anthology, included her work, prompting Publishers Weekly to note, even sophisticates can still make discoveries here, among them Lola Ridge. Perhaps Ridge's time has come at last. And now I'll read you the end, because of course you want to read the beginning and know how it comes out in the end, right? Well, a lot of things happen. She was bold and brave and wild in her life because the precept that she followed was freedom. So she, I'll give you a quick précis for these 300 pages so you're not too surprised when you get there. She left New Zealand via Australia with her 8-year-old son, left him at an orphanage in Los Angeles. She went on and had, in 10 years, she was the belle of the ball in the modernist world in New York. And she edited those 2 magazines. She went to Baghdad and toured Mexico by herself, not only by herself in the 1930s, but also without any money. She begged her way check by check, the way Isadora Duncan did, all the way there and then all the way back. So it was, she maintained her liberty. And then came by way of California back to New York to the, She took a lover at the age 61 in Mexico, and then finally when she was penniless in California, she managed to make her way back to her husband and then died a few years later. So that's something, but there's lots of other items happening. Lola Ridge was always serious. That's like let's see, there's only one photo of her smiling in the archives at Smith, and it was taken during her student years in Australia before she assumed her American mask. All the dental problems mentioned in her letters may have contributed to her decision never to smile, or maybe she wanted a pose that always implied seriousness, the way Emma Goldman portraits always show a scowl. She was always serious. Evelyn Scott, her best friend, her blurb for Firehead reveals how well her best friend understood her. Ridge came to America seeking freedom, not the licentiousness that may go by that name, but the freedom of an artist whose passion for form, for symmetry, was the passion for the most perfect justice, freedom with responsibility and the opportunity to create. Ridge saw very clearly where freedom's repressions could lead. Her brilliant sonnet Electrocution, written before Sacco and Vanzetti were executed, the only poem that matches her acute social conscience with her wavering ability with form, captures the way democracy deals finally with its people. Electrocution. He shudders, feeling on a shaved spot the probing wind that stabs him to a thought of storm-drenched fields in a white foam of light, and roads of his hill town that leap to sight like threads of tortured silver, while the guards, monstrous deaf dolls that move as on a string, in wonted haste to finish with this thing, turn faces blanker than asphalted yards. They heard the shriek that tore out of its sheath, but as a feeble man moan, yet dared not breathe, who stared there at him arching like a tree when the winds wrench it and the earth holds tight, whose soul, expanding in white agony, had fused in flaming circuit with the night. Thank you. Can I answer any questions you might have with regard to this subject or any other?
Yeah.
Yes.
How did you find out about her and decide to do the book?
Well, I read an article in 2011 on Slate. Robert Pinsky had this wonderful weekly, I think, or maybe it was monthly, column that he would take out of copyright poems and then have a discussion, and then they have like 300 responses. It was just wonderful. Anyway, he did Lola Ridge. He called her street poet, and I had never heard of her before, and I read it, and I put some comment at the end that made me sound like a crazy woman, because I went back to look at it thinking, well, what was it about that that was so inviting? And he didn't quote the poems, which I considered to be so interesting. The only thing I could see was she lived in the neighborhood that I lived in, the Lower East Side, 100 years earlier. And of course, her first and probably most famous book, The Ghetto and Other Poems, is all about that neighborhood. It's a very sympathetic portrait of it. But I found out so many other things, which I think must happen to all biographers, that there is some unconscious connection that turns out to be real as I was going along in my investigation. So it was love at first sight, really. And I don't think I'll ever write another biography. It was truly an exhausting experience. Yeah.
I can imagine the amount of research that had to be done.
Well, first of all, she had terrible handwriting.
Oh.
Yeah.
Doctor's handwriting.
Yes, definitely.
Wow.
Yeah.
Did you read a couple of her poems interspersed with the biography? Is that the style through the whole book?
Yes, there's poems that come that attempt to illuminate the facts of the biography.
Right.
Yes.
Excellent.
Yes.
I had never heard. I mean, I saw the blurb about Lola Ridge. I'd never heard of her.
Yes.
And the description was simply, radical feminist poet, when I've never heard of, and I'm like, how is that possible?
Yes.
How so? How do you explain the?
Well, partly her executor had the lock on all of her work for the last 40 years, when it should have been made public. And when researchers came to talk to her about her subject, she would go into the back room and pull out a little something and bring it out, but no one ever saw it. I still haven't seen half the archives. She wouldn't let me near them. but as you can tell, there was still, by this time, her work was out of copyright. And a lot of those little pieces of paper that she brought out to justify why she was holding onto the archive had then become part of other scholars' work. So, for example, the letters between Lola and Emma Goldman were easy to find, and so forth. She has the originals, but they now have copies in other archives. So that was very helpfor So that's the first reason. And the second reason was there was a concerted effort from the mid 40s to the mid 50s, and really had repercussions into the 70s and 80s, to tamp down any idea that poets should be writing about political subjects. I mean, Allen Ginsberg arrived, but there was certainly, as described by Al Filreis, he wrote a wonderful book about, the FBI following Muriel Rukeyser and Genevieve Taggart losing her job in Sarah Lawrence because there was the taint of, well, she was a communist, but all of that. William Carlos Williams turned down the poet laureateship because of the possibility that he might have had a communist background.
But it was always leftist politics. I mean,
Yes.
nobody ever did Ezra Pound's.
No, that was fine. We'll give him a prize, right? Yes, that did not escape my notice. So anyway, those two converged on Lola to really, she disappeared. But there are reprints of the first two books. There have been many reprints of those first two books, just not. She wrote two, another problem is she wrote two books at the end where she went off. Hart Crane was one of her. He would come to the parties and she published him and encouraged him, and he would never really have had an European audience without her and so forth. But so she decided that she would go his way for the last two books, and it was a mistake. I don't know what you feel about Crane, but it's a tough row to hoe, really, to go back to Elizabethan and try to rework that. Oh.
Seems like an exercise in futility.
Yes. Well, I don't know. The modernists were casting about for how to become new again all the time, and so they thought that they could just fling up something from the past and make it exciting. And it's not a bad theory. Thee, thou, you could get used to it. I don't know.
Would you say she was an activist poet?
Well, I don't know. In today's terms, that would mean going around, I presume, and collecting signatures, and like Grace Paley getting arrested on the White House lawn. She was arrested in Sacco and Vanzetti's demonstration, but she thought her best contribution was in her poetry, and so she didn't put herself in the way of harm that often. She didn't take in the poor and the homeless. She had an interesting. She was a complicated woman, and people remembered her as being very poor and sickly. And that she was poor because she wouldn't work. She wouldn't work at anything except poetry, which was really the last generation you could even consider doing that, because she could get patrons. And she was sickly. It was never clear why she was sickly, but there were a lot of advantages to being sickly. So I have her friend Evelyn Scott called her the Brunhilde of the sickbed. So it's an interesting ploy. And of course, I began the biography being completely in love with her, and then about halfway through, I was completely disgusted with her. And then I had to work my way back to figuring out what was really important. So, and I think many biographers have trace that route. But anyway, it was an adventure.
So when you worked your way back,
Yes.
where did you end up?
Well, kind of in between. I understood the kinds of decisions that she made in light of her beliefs, which is all you can, you can't judge someone from, the vantage of many years later, really. And so I had a sympathy. For example, leaving her son at an orphanage, that is it seems like a showstopper right there, but then you consider that the English would drop their children off at the boarding house at about the same age and really have very little contact with them. Also, poor people in that era, which was really around the turn of the century, would use orphanages as a way. They would put the children in the orphanage and then gather money and then take them out again, which the orphanages complained about, but it was the only sane thing to do. It was instead of going to the poorhouse. So, and women of that era did all kinds of things to figure out how to deal with children and careers and their ambitions that seem extremely radical to us now. And anarchists, they didn't know what to do with children at all. There was one article which I quote in here, which I found to be just startling. The woman said that when children grow up, they should endeavor to pay back every penny that their parents had paid on them to show that the effort was worth it, or else they should commit suicide. That was the solution for anarchists. Yeah, well.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah, interesting. Yes. And I didn't know very much about modernism nor anarchy when I started off, and I think that's an advantage, at least.
Also, that was a time when there weren't too many options not to have children.
Yes,
And if you wanted to have a life where you weren't necessarily a saint and being celibate, you had to deal with the consequences.
yes,
And sometimes that meant giving the child away in order to have the freedom.
she was. There is a woman named Voltairine de Cleyre, who should be better known. An anarchist around the same time as Emma Goldman, and she was apparently amazing. And she had a child who didn't know that she was the mother until she was 15, who stayed with the father. So people sorted these things out differently, but it was the same problem. She had absolutely no interest in being a mother. Well, Muriel Spark, let me think, there's a lot of English women that had this situation. Doris Lessing, yeah.
Really? I didn't know that.
What, Doris Lessing?
Yeah, I missed it.
Mm.
Good to know.
Yeah.
Yeah, for women, I think it's a more serious decision what to do with a child or not have a child,
Yes.
because we are judged, and our identities, especially as we get older, is so attached to that mother archetype that it's very difficult my opinion, it's very difficult to get people to see you as a woman after a certain age and
Yes.
not be identified as mother. It kind of throws people off. It's like they don't know where to put you, even today.
Yeah. Well, Jean-Jacques Rousseau left 8 bastards at the doorsteps of the orphanage, so
Yeah, and everybody thinks he's great.
yes, he could discuss education of the child with great authority, yes.
Oh, yeah.
Who did, I missed the name.
Rousseau, yes.
Jeez.
Just disillusioning you.
That's why I put this gossip in here, the important gossip.
She's up there. Did she ever reconnect with the child?
She did. They tossed children out of the orphanage at age 14 because they were adults then. So she lived with him and her new boyfriend, whom she married. She was a bigamist. You leave them in New Zealand, you don't bother with the rest of it.
We'll find out.
Yeah. No, we never found out. And they lived together for 3 years, and then she left him in Detroit at age 17, and she never saw him again after that. She was really haunted by him. That was my theory anyway. And so there were repercussions with regard to this kind of the strange material she produced toward the end of her life. And as well, she might have been haunted with him. Well, I'm going to give away all of my details. But a year after she died, her son committed suicide. And he was living in Chile, so it took him probably quite a long time to get the copy of the Saturday Review that had her obituary in it. And then I talked to her granddaughter about it. Yeah. Which actually is also contextualized. There are lots of poets' children have a terrible time. Louis Untermeyer divorced his wife in an effort to become a more pure poet, and then his son committed suicide as a result. And Eleanor Wiley's son, that she abandoned at the age of 3, appeared at her funeral at the age of 19, and then he committed suicide a year later. So, and there's Sylvia Plath, one of her children. So there's you assume that a poet, has a sensitivity not only to language but to emotion as well, so that that sensitivity could be handed down, and maybe they are not as gifted, or they choose to not express themselves in the same way, so it must be hard. Yes?
So it was her audience largely reading her or listening to her speak?
She gave that speech about women and the creative will in 1919 in Chicago only once. And so her contemporaries knew her from her books. And, poetry then was part of the parlance. I mean, it appeared in the newspapers on the front page, and it was, something you could meet a poet back then.
Is she better? I feel like I'm having a hard time hearing her voice, honestly.
Ah,
Do you feel like maybe there's either another poem you'd like to read, or do you?
sure. I have a poem that I'm very fond of her second book, Sun Up and Other Poems, which is the story of the title poem is about this bad girl, and she's very bad, but very understandably bad. So her mother gives her this doll, and I don't suppose any of you have ever have a Barbie that has been mutilated or anything. I beat Janie and beat her, and still she smiled. So I scratched her between the eyes with a pin. Now she doesn't love me anymore. She scowls and scowls, though I begged her to forgive me and poured sugar in the hole at the back of her head.
That is such a modern.
That's a great
That is such a modern
Yes,
sentiment. It's incredible that she wrote it.
yes.
so long ago.
Yeah, I think it demonstrates too how we have women's relationship with dolls can be very interesting.
Well, let's see. Another one kind of shows how she felt about being a child in New Zealand and women in general. Little girls sit there dressed in white, and the dolls in their arms all have white handkerchiefs over their faces. Their shadows cannot play with them. Their shadows lie down at their feet, for the little girls sit stiff as stones with their backs to the mouth of the cave, where a little light falls off, the wings of the silence, when it comes down out of the sun. I thought she was very good with the little girls. I hadn't heard that voice before, even in contemporary. I mean, you can hear that somewhat more similar now, but not for 75 years. You get this sentimentalized, I'll see if I can find you one more, version of what childhood is like, and she doesn't do that. She goes right for, well, now I have to go back into this one. Do you want to hear one more? Okay. Well, here's an anti-war one, of World War I, The Fire. The old men of the world have made a fire to warm their trembling hands. They poke the young men in. The young men burn like withes. I think that's kind of wood. If one runs a little way, the old men are wrath. They catch him and bind him and throw him again to the flames. Green withes burn slow, and the smoke of the young men's torment rises round and sheer as the trunk of a pillared oak, and the darkness thereof spreads over the sky. Green withes burn slow, and the old men of the world sit around the fire and rub their hands, but the smoke of the young men's torment ascends up forever and ever.
That one will do it.
So the reason why you say you don't hear her voice is because she likes, with the exception of the second book, to write in a more generalized top of the mountain kind of voice that Ezra Pound was taking on and Eliot was taking on. So it's unusual to hear it from a woman, I think. You expect it to be more personal. So the greensman gave her a cabbage, that's to her mother, and she held it against her black bodice and said what a beautiful green it was, and put it on the table as though it had been a flower. But the next day we boiled and ate it with salt. It was our dinner. So clear. But there is a shadow that is not a shadow of a thing. It is a thing itself. When you meet this shadow, you must not look too long at it, till you are all alone with nothing around you, nothing, nothing, nothing but a shadow and its eyes full of black light. Well, let's see. So this is what happened to Janie the doll. Yesterday I took Janie out and tied my handkerchief over her face and put sand in it and threw her in a ditch down into the black water under the dock leaves. And when Mama asked me where Janie was, I said I'd lost her. So those are just pieces of one long poem in Sun Up and Other Poems, which ends with her having a fantasy playmate named Jude, a boy, who in the end turns out to be her bisexual self. So it's very interesting for that reason too. And she had always, at least the second half of her life, proposed that she write a sequel to that book, and then grandiosity overcame her, and she decided she would write, the world's poem from the point of view of Baghdad and and the beginnings of Babylon, and so we never got that poem.
Do you think she ever ran into Dorothy Day if she was on the lawyer's side?
That's interesting. There's a guy whom I'm not happy about, who has done the selected poems of Lola Ridge, and he had suggested that she was similar to her. And Lola was always, in her lifetime, suggested to be the saint. So there aren't any...
Dorothy Day wasn't much of a saint either.
Yes, exactly.
She might be beatified or something.
But no, as far as I know, she didn't have anything to do with Dorothy. She wasn't in the streets. She was off to Yaddo or McDowell or somewhere and looking for patrons. But you do not see me, who am a torch blown along the wind, flickering to a spark, but never out. Yeah, thank you. Welcome. Yeah.
How about one of your new poems?
Oh, you want?
Cut off conversation.
I'll read if you want. I have 4 very short poems. Slaughter of the Centaurs. Woods, glades, copses, massed oak, the vines of Atreus, trillium, dogbane, an excess of green, the insects cryptic with cold, green with a fine English mist that softens the streaks of blood glistening on the flanks of the coarsely forelocked boys, none more than 15, beardless, death catching them cantering, berets cocked, weapons not. See the tattoos on their chests, their mermaid swinging hair, the laughing snake? They went as we will. See the strong hooves still twitching, the warm earth ravaged in reflex? But they were warriors, planted in their mothers' wombs for nothing else, their beautiful tails curled around their wet bellies, lifted so delicately to fan the light. Brighter now, you can see boys in wrecked jeeps in camouflage. For about a year in South Sudan, and doing some translating, and the anthropologist who founded the discipline of social anthropology studied the same people that I lived with, the New Air. He's E. Evans Pritchard. So I begin this poem with a quote from him. The poem is called Obscenity. The quote is, "Obscenity is not often an expression uttered by an individual under great stress and condemned in bad taste, but one permitted and even prescribed by society. Among the Ba'ilah, among, as if swarming the petri dish of the British imperialist, there exist expressions used collectively, that is, in the presence of women and children. In fact, in chorus, since these obscenities are sung, not scrawled across a riverbank where innocent boaters of Victorian persuasion might encounter them. His great penis is a size, a thing without end. It must have been a long unwinding. The female mourner's song, the trot arch, as if the words themselves might make the gored warrior rise in tumescence. Sometimes it's just what they do with their hands, singing, writes the patrician scientist, who considered obscenity a privilege, a way to spur routine labor with ardor, or to invoke life at the moment of death. I drag in the anthropological so one can reject the paradigm of the primitive. We who have no physical labor, which requires our neighbor, nor sustained interest in creation, except in art, that work to ward off death. There will always be those in the boat who slow down, who listen and transcribed in their tiny script. I think, oh yes, this is the title poem. When the next big war blows down the valley. So you imagine, you'll imagine. Flame casts the overhang in shadow, so no one can see anyone behind the clubs or sharpened sticks each has made for himself in the boredom of the many dusks, when the spilt blood has dried or sunk into the red dirt at the bottom, where food grows and women dance and trees promise drums, and from where no one ever escapes, but takes up the broken, sharpened sticks and cuts rows into the freshened earth, until all they remember of those from before is their small size and not their own good luck. This is bridge, comma, mother. Mother burns on the other side of the bridge. Mother burns the bridge and is safe on the other side. Mother is not on the bridge when it burns. When mother says burn, the bridge burns. We can't get to the other side. The bridge is burning. Mother is the bridge that we burn. She is how we get to the other side. We can't burn the bridge without her. Mother burns and we burn, bridge or no bridge. She is the other side. Nothing burns the bridge, and then it burns. Thank you.
Yeah. Terese, before everyone came, you and I were talking about some of the other things you've got in your pipeline. Would you like to just share?
No.
I can't believe how prolific this one is.
So well, it's not prolific. I have just a deep drawer. So this was in November. This was in February. I have a new book of poetry from Eyewear, a British publisher, in September. A new book of short stories in 2017. And I was just getting a contract for a new novel in 2017 too. And I have another novel which is working with my editor on. So, it pours, and the rest of the time it's a desert. What can I say? So.
It's impressive to have that much.
Yeah, all of a sudden.
Coming to life.
Yeah, it's just
What do you
amazing.
find is the main distinction between novel writing then and poetry? In your opinion?
Oh, those words!
Well, I'm just curious 'cause,
Plot. Poets don't have to deal with plot. And my husband here, every so often I call him and bring him in. He looks and tells me, you can't do that, and what happened to so-and-so. So that's very handy because to me the words are the important part, right? I would say that's the difference.
You have a preference? Because you're moving toward more prose, it seems like.
Well, it's, no, they're tied, 6 and 6.
Okay.
Preference. Oh, poetry will always be the most important thing because that's the most powerful. And It contains all of culture. Who could not love poetry? I mean, storytelling, it's good, but poetry, that's where it comes from.
How do you really feel?
Pardon me?
I'm
Yeah.
being sarcastic.
Yeah, all right, yeah. No.
I find that interesting when you say that, because growing up with no poetry,
Hmm.
I see a class difference, and I see the way, for myself as a writer, that it is easier for me to relate to prose than to poetry.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. I can tell the story, but I can't construct the words in poetry. Because it was just I never really encountered teaching of it until I got to college,
Hmm.
when I was in my 30s. So it's a foreign language to me. And I wonder about the importance of poetry in the 21st century.
You're questioning the importance of poetry in the 21st century? It has been questioned ever since, let me think. Anne Carson wrote this wonderful book in which she hypothesized that Simonides, as soon as he accepted money for his poetry was doomed. And before that, instead of currency, when they finally got the coins arranged, the poet's pay was to sit next to the king and praise him. And after that, it was everybody's business. So that was a downfall. And we haven't been accepting money since, however. So
Aha, that's the key.
yeah, that must be it.
Gee, then I must really be a poet.
But both my parents had memorized a lot of poetry. I think it was their generation, and so. But my mother knew Eliot, but my father liked Vachel Lindsay, so we had a lot of boomalea, boomalea, boom. But it wasn't presented as a mystery or a puzzle to be solved. I think that's the difference. And a lot of people, especially in grade school, they understand it that way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it becomes a very difficult thing of understanding rhyme and meter and the relationship.
Yeah, that's
of
right.
Word to image.
And really, that doesn't have much to do with the excitement of poetry, actually.
Because now we live in a visually saturated culture, image saturated.
Yes.
That, this is just my impression of things, that the image becomes primary over the image created in words. You can go out and take a picture with your phone versus sitting down and thinking,
All those texts. Always, if they're not announcing that the novel is dead, poetry has been dead for a millennium. And there you have it. I was raising money and writing the treatments for a 13-part poetry series in the 80s called Voices and Visions. And you would get into a cab, and this was before they had poetry on TV at all. And you get into a cab in New York, and they, get in a conversation. You'd say, what you were doing. Inevitably, the guy had a sheaf of poems in the glove box or from under his seat, and there you would be. Everybody was doing it secretly. It was like sex or something. It was amazing. So even though, with your logical brain, you're saying that this art form cannot continue, it's happening.
I was just rereading Donald Hall's interview with the Paris Review,
Yeah.
where he talks about that whole thing about there is no literary capital in the United States anymore. It's you have these groups of poets wandering all over the place, and everybody is writing poetry. It's just it's all over. It's just there's no one focus.
Yeah.
I
That's
also
right.
think the teaching of poetry in schools is part of the problem.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Yeah, totally agree.
it's just made to be too intellectual and not experiential.
Mm-hmm.
You don't look at an abstract painting and you experience an abstract painting. You don't try to analyze it, and that's becoming more and more the thing. But I think growing up in schools, we were taught, here's how you analyze a poem, and the x-axis, y-axis, and meaning and content and form, and
Yeah.
it's not a.
And after that, there's nothing left.
nothing
There's
left.
not-
You suck all
Poor
the
little
juice out of
poem.
it.
Yeah.